Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to NDC for the warm welcome and for all of you for coming to my talk today. This talk is called Design for Developers. So the idea of this appeared because I'm a designer, sorry. But I've worked in a lot of small kind of digital agencies, mostly working with front-end devs, handing off designs to them. And they've often asked me for kind of tips and tricks on how to improve their own designs, as well as things that have come up in the kind of QA testing from handing off designs to them. I also have a lot of other developer friends working on their own kind of side projects, things that they've built with a lot of love, but just need a little bit more love on the design front. I unfortunately have a friend who's vibe coding her own website. And while I can't give her any code advice, I can give her some design advice. So that's where this talk's kind of born out of. And I'm aware that I can't give a very comprehensive design course in an hour. It's just not going to happen. So this is a 1-hour friendly talk on some recurring topics that I always get asked about as a designer from developers that I've worked with. So I'm going to cover the following. First, we're going to go through some of the principles of design. So that's kind of a set of rules to follow and that you can come back to. Second, I'll go through some handy tips around elements like typography, color, imagery, layout. And lastly, we'll have some kind of before and after examples of how you can refine some existing designs. So if we're not starting from scratch, we'll go through that at the end. So just to very quickly introduce myself, my name is Lex Lofthouse. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm kind of just on Blue Sky now. So I think that's how you present the handle of it. It's also my website URL as well, so it's on there if anyone wants to catch up with that. As I said, I'm a designer, and I have been for around 15 years now. Mostly web-based, but I do dabble in some brand and print design as well. Like I said, I've spent most of my career in small design agencies. I currently work for an agency in Nottingham in the UK that's called Enzyme, and I work alongside a development team there. So, enough about me. Let's kick off with the principles. So these are the fundamentals that we need to cover, some core principles of design. I've cut this list down to 4. I don't want to overwhelm. There are more than 4 principles of design, but I think these are the key ones that we can keep in mind when embarking on a design. So, they are hierarchy, proximity, contrast, and balance. So let's dive into these. So we'll start with hierarchy. Similarly to how we think of hierarchy in other aspects of the world, it's a system in which things are arranged according to their importance. Now, good design will usually indicate to you a very clear hierarchy of content. It's a relatively simple principle to implement in design because there's a few ways to do it, but one of the easiest and most simple methods to implement this principle is with scale. So the biggest thing on the page is probably going to be the most important. If we're thinking of text, for example, heading 1 is usually the biggest and it ascends down. But there are other ways than scale that we can implement this, and I'll touch on that later in the presentation. One of those is using contrast, which actually leads nicely into the next principle, because contrast is one in its own right. So this is achieved by having things be somewhat the opposite to each other in order to create a sense of emphasis. So one way that we can use contrast in design is to highlight an element on a page against something else and really draw the eye to that. It goes hand in hand with hierarchy, really. Other times, contrast can just be a really, really crucial part of the interface, especially when it comes to accessibility, for example. So text should have quite high color contrast in order for it to be easy to read for everybody. So we can use color, scale, styles, all sorts to create contrast in our design as well. Then we have proximity. So when it comes to design on the web, proximity is looking at the content that we've got and understanding the relationship that those pieces of content have with one another. Then organizing them on the page in a way that conveys that visually. So the distance, or the lack of distance between objects, helps us humans group things together in our brains and form those connections between the content. So to use text as an example again, if we have a heading and then there's a paragraph sat very closely underneath, you can safely say that those two things are going to relate to each other because of their proximity. So it's a really important principle to follow. And it's the card I always pull out when people ask me to fill the white space. The distance between objects is just as important as the lack of distance, and white space plays a big part in that. The last principle is balance. So this is what I would call the distribution of visual weight across a screen. This approach in particular, in this example here, is called symmetrical balance. So this is where all of your elements are equal and distributed equally on the page. There's often that kind of invisible center line down the middle there. It's very balanced, like a set of scales. There is also asymmetrical balance, but I don't want to complicate things right now. I do have an example later. Let's keep it simple just now. So balance offers this aesthetically pleasing layout with consistency. And consistency is always a very good approach in UI design. Users on the web enjoy balance and consistency because it reinforces decisions and actions that they take through repetition. So balance, key to that. So if I come back, these are our 4 design principles to keep in mind. Like I said, not a full list, but a solid basis to return to. I suggest if you're getting a bit stuck, come back and remind yourself of these. I'm 15 years into doing this, and I will always come back to the design principles when I get stuck. It does come kind of naturally, but some days I can't see the forest for the trees, and I need to go back to the fundamentals. I imagine it's a similar thing that happens in development. If you're grafting away at a problem and you get a bit lost with it, you have to take a step back to remind yourself of kind of how to get that right. So sometimes we can overcomplicate things when the right path is the most simple one. So let's take a look at putting these into practice. I want to go through some tips and tricks, recurring problems, and issues that come up quite often when designing for the web. So I'd like to start with typography. Now, no judgment at all, but from my experience working alongside developers, the typography stuff is usually the thing that I find that people struggle with quite a lot. And typography is a bit of an art that you do learn over time, but that doesn't mean that we have to make it hard for ourselves. So let's dive in. So, depending on what you're working on, you might need to choose some fonts. So, how do we best do that? How do we choose those? My kind of cheat code for that is to choose a font pairing. So, choose one font for the headings and one font for the paragraphs. This will help bring a sense of hierarchy. It'll have that visual difference without just relying on sizing. But it also keeps things simple. There is no need to exceed this number. It will only make your life more difficult. And also, developers are always asking me how to keep my font choices to a minimum for site speed and stuff as well, so I think we're all on the same page anyway. So, for our headings, when it comes to deciding on a font or a typeface, I'm not fussy, whichever term you want to use, how do we decide what we use for headings? Well, you can be a bit braver with headings. They're usually shorter, larger, more attention-grabbing bits of copy on the page. So we can go for a bit more of a decorative or stylized font here, something that adds a bit of character to your type. It still has to be legible, but you can be a little bit more out of the box with that. But when it comes to your paragraph font, this is where we need to play it a little bit more safe. We need to choose a simpler font, something that's easy to read, because this text is going to be smaller, it's going to be in larger, heavy paragraphs and sections, and it's important that the font doesn't hinder that reading experience for the user. But where do you start? How do you know which fonts are going to work? That comes down to knowing the type of business or the brand or the project that you're working on. Fonts, especially the heading font, can really help embody the brand or nicely complement the style or tone of the brand. And that's how you can start to decide which fonts to choose. So I'll demonstrate that with an example. So here's a bit of hero copy that you might find atop a website. It's currently just in a default kind of font choice, no styling applied. So let's say that our business is an antivirus software company. Here's how you might style that. For the heading, I've gone for this modern, quite simple font, but it also has a bit of character to it. The G's, and the Y have these unique kind of descenders that come down at an angle. It's a bit techy. And then paired with that, for the body copy, I just have a really simple sans serif font there. It's easy to read at smaller sizes. And quite importantly, with the kind of paragraph font I've chosen here, it has a number of available weights to it. So if I want to emphasize certain words, I can use the bold weight or the italic weight. And you might find on a hunt for fonts that some only have one available weight. And that's a good indicator that they might be more suitable for headings or maybe not even at all. But what if this copy was not meant for a software company? What if instead it was meant for a healthcare business? So in this case, I have chosen a serif font for our heading. It's a little more traditional, but here in particular, it conveys quite an established, trustworthy tone to it. It has a bit of a softness to it as well, which works quite well with the healthcare message. So we're playing it kind of safe, but that's okay. And again, there's no real reason why you can't pair a serif and a sans serif font together. So I've used a similarly quite simple font for the paragraphs here. So while we're using the same text for both examples, the tone has completely changed between the two of them. Fonts and font choices can convey a hell of a lot very quickly, which is why designers are obsessed with them as well. But they do matter, and this is a classic example from Don McMillan about why font choices matter. It shows the importance of not getting it incredibly wrong, so you can go all the way off the other end with font choices there. But if you do feel really stuck, just play it safe. Just keep it simple. I'll just use one font if you're really, really worried about it, because I'll let you into a little design secret. This is us most of the time, just flicking through fonts, trying to find hours you can spend on this. It's not an easy task. And our favorite fonts are usually the ones that have very universal application and appeal. So fonts like Helvetica, Gotham, Inter, there is usually a flavor of the month, and they all kind of look similar. But the reason for this is because they're easy to apply across a different range of projects. However, you shouldn't get stuck, because I've got some good resources for you. This one is called FontPair, fontpair.co. They've got a large range of example pairings. It uses Google Fonts, which I know can be quite favorable, especially with more low-budget projects as well, where free fonts can be a bit of a godsend. So all the text is customizable on here, and you can have a play around and see what works without having to download any fonts or install them on your site. So great little tool. I use it quite a bit. So aside from fonts, I want to take a quick look at sizing and how our kind of principles apply here as well. So first is looking at the paragraph text or the body copy. So for this, you want to ensure that your minimum size works well for accessibility. The commonly suggested minimum size is 16 pixels. It's not a hard, like it's not a solid hard rule, but it's one that I typically will implement to avoid any issues, especially around accessibility. Then for headings, we need to set the sizes based on that hierarchy principle. So heading 1 being the largest, and then the rest in that kind of descending order. There are quite a few tried and tested approaches to getting those sizes right and the scales right. Again, I have another good tool that I use all the time. This is Typescale, type-scale.com. It's a game changer for me because I'm not very good at maths. So it scales the headings mathematically based on the scaling method that you choose. This one is using major thirds, but there are more available on there. And it'll generate you a series of heading sizes. If you pair that with another tool, I've got lots of tools on here. But if you pair that with Utopia's Fluid Typescale calculator, you've got a great recipe for headings with hierarchy, great contrast in your paragraph, and then also how that works responsively as well. So another great tool. They all kind of work very well together and can help you on that journey. So why is setting scales important? It comes back to that hierarchy principle more than anything, because despite being the first thing on the page, nobody ever reads that top line. So hierarchy doesn't always come down to the order of things on the page. It usually comes down to the prominence, and sizing is a huge part of that, and something that's relatively easy to get right. Okay, moving on from sizing. I'd like to talk about line heights. This is a common issue I run into when working with developers. I apologize, but it happens a lot. So here's 3 examples of different line heights to demonstrate the power of getting the balance right here. It's a bit of a Goldilocks situation. So on this end of the scale, the line height is just too small. It bunches the text together, so it's quite difficult to read. And sometimes our default line spacing can be like this, so we need to go in and adjust that as well. On the far end of the scale, now we've gone too far. The line height here is too much. It makes the text harder to read, just in a different sort of way. And here's our nice middle ground. So the line height here makes the paragraph easy, pleasing to read. There's enough space between the lines, but not too much. And there's 2 principles that kind of come into effect here. So proximity, especially for that kind of end example, where all the text is really far away. I used to behave like that as a junior designer, and my old boss said words that have clearly stuck with me and traumatized me for life. But he would say, you could fit a bus through those gaps. So yeah, that's lived with me ever since, so I don't do that anymore. So if things are too far away, it feels like they don't belong, so that's the issue with that bit. And then balance also comes into effect. So that example where everything is squished together, it's not a nice distribution of weight across that paragraph and on the page. So getting that right can really be make a big difference to the user's experience. Then we have paragraph spacing. So this is an even worse crime that I've come across with developers. Again, I'm sorry. So here I mean the space where there are clear breaks, so after headings, between paragraphs, and at the end of paragraphs. So again, here we have two examples of that. One is bad and one is good. So let's break down the good example first. So here, the spacing between the paragraphs and after the headings should be very similar, if not the same, in size. And that ensures that the section of text looks like it belongs together, but it also still gives those natural breaks like we would read it aloud. Then we have the spacing at the end of the paragraph, but before the next heading. So this should be larger than the previous because it indicates to the user that the section is done. It gives them a moment of pause before they move on to the next. Again, how we follow that as if we were reading aloud. And if we compare that to our example on the left here, we can start to see the problems and why paragraph spacing is so important. The proximity principle, not really considered on our left example, as the spacing of each section of text doesn't help us connect that content together to the right things. All these different spacing sizes brings no consistency to the design and therefore throws off the balance of that. So a very important one to get right. So I've had enough of type now. That's enough. That's enough to get you going. Let's move on to touch on color and some tips on color palettes. So yeah, what I'd like to touch on is creating a color palette to use across your design and where you kind of start with that. When it comes to choosing colors, I follow a very similar principle to the typography one. Let's keep it simple. Start with one, and then we can build the rest of our color palettes around that. And I suggest starting with a main color that you want to associate with your brand or your project. Again, if you're stuck here, you can go to some tried and tested methods. You can look at color theory. So color theory explains the type of feelings associated with certain colors. Now, these brands here, they may well have chosen their brand color because of this. I don't know. I didn't work with them. But Dairy Milk might have chosen purple because it's quite luxurious. McDonald's might have gone with yellow because of happiness and Happy Meal, things like that. It's not always why brands choose colors, though. And you don't have to choose a color just because it matches this and that it means something. It's kind of like getting a tattoo. Some have meaning. Some are just something that you're drawn to and that you like. So it doesn't always have to come back to this, but it is a good place to start if you are stuck. So once we've chosen that one color, then we can start to build out 3 different color palettes. So we would start with a main palette. So this will be that one color, and then a very, very small selection of other colors that you'll use quite commonly. Then you have a supporting palette. So these will be less commonly used colors, but typically might have a bit more choice. And then the last is neutrals or shades. So this is a set of colors to complement the other palettes and that you can use for a bit more flexibility, especially on the web. So I'd like to just show an example of this using a kind of familiar brand, which is Uber, although I've heard that there's no Ubers in Copenhagen, so maybe not familiar enough here. This might be a terrible example. Hopefully you'll have seen it anyway. So this is Uber's main color palette. They start with one color, which is the black. That is their main brand color. Then to add to this, they choose white. And they choose white because it's a good, very good contrasting color to the black. Perfect. That's 2. Then they add a third main color, which is this blue. And I would call this an accent color, which looks like it's used quite sparingly, but it's used with a lot of purpose in the Uber brand. As you can see in the screenshot, they've used it for some iconography, which is cool. Oh yeah, there's a screen here as well. This is my Uber profile. The rating's not too bad. But in here, they use it with a lot of purpose, the blue. It shows me that I need to finish a safety checkup, which I don't know what that is. But it's also showing me a small notification there that I have a message as well. So it's used with a lot of purpose, and that's why it belongs in that main color palette. Then they have a supporting color palette. So this contains twice as many colors, but they're used a lot less within their branding. They're often used for these kind of supporting illustrations. They work well with the primary palette, but they are predominantly used in more supporting elements. So colors like the green from this actually have evolved now for Uber. They use that for their Uber Eats brand. So it's used a bit less and with a bit more purpose, actually. That might move into their main kind of palette. But there's a lot of colors here, which can look a bit scary. You don't have to have that many. It doesn't have to be like that. In fact, if you're unsure, a supporting palette might not be needed at all. You do, however, need that third one, which is some neutrals and some shades. So again, here's the example from Uber, where they have chosen the main color, the black, and then they've created a palette of grays and neutrals to be used for some flexibility and interactivity. So again, here's some screenshots from the app. So it's used to indicate where I can input a search, where I can make a choice, and can click through to those bars are obviously blanking out where I live and things like that. So it can be used for some flexibility there. And it helps give a bit of depth again and some hierarchy there. Having that kind of palette structure with their main, supporting, and neutrals can really help guide you in your design and create that sense of hierarchy by having those work in different places. A quick tip for those neutral shades is taking a look at that main palette and seeing what kind of tones you're using. So if you're using quite cool shades, so like blues, make sure that your neutrals follow that too. So you could have a tinge of blue within those shades. Or if you're using warmer tones, like an orange, you can add a bit of that orange tint into the neutral palette there. It's just making sure that your colors complement each other quite nicely. So choosing colors, I do have another go-to tool. This is Adobe Color. You do not need an Adobe subscription for this. It's free. It's on the web. And I use this a lot because you can create an entire palette starting with that one color that we spoke about at the start there. So you can apply different harmony rules. So complementary, shades for your neutrals, monochromatic. There's some different choices on there for you to be able to create palettes. And those are quite tried and tested methods again. And yeah, the shades element there is really, really useful for those neutrals. But small word of warning is just to make sure that the colors that you do choose consider accessibility as a priority. So you might have created a beautiful color palette, but unless those colors provide enough contrast on the page, then they might not be accessible for everyone. So running those colors through something like WebAIM to check the color contrast, you can see if it passes AA or AAA standards on there. And this is an instance where the contrast principle isn't just nice for a design, but it's crucial for the web and the experience for your users as well. Another color-related tip, don't rely on color as a sole indicator for something. Some people won't see color the same as you. Some people have a level of color blindness, for example. And therefore, we need to give them more indication than just a color. So here's a list of tasks that I have to do with a status attached. So one's marked red, which I haven't completed yet. And one is marked with green at the bottom, which I have completed. But the color here isn't really enough to indicate that. You might have people who see these colors differently or don't see them at all here. So Sometimes I view stuff on my phone in black and white, especially past a certain time at night when I'm like doom scrolling. So there's other reasons than just color blindness as well that people might be viewing something without the color attached there. So instead, these could be accompanied with icons potentially to help give a bit more context. So if we remove the color from those icons, it's still a lot more contextual without that. But there is another word of warning when it comes to icons that you use in your design. So iconography is this age-old way of communicating, and it's something that we often see and use around the web. But with icons, it can be very easy to assume that the user knows what the icon means just because we do. There are some typical icons that we see every day, and we all know what they mean. We know what's going to happen when we click these icons, for example. And these are what we call universal icons. They are known. We know what they are. Most people know what they're going to do. Now, let's consider what these icons might represent. They're perhaps not quite as familiar or obvious in what their actions might mean if we click them. They could be quite ambiguous. So the heart could mean like, the middle one could be repost, and the last one might be a link to a live chat. Or potentially not. They might not be that obvious. So my one tip is, if you're using icons, give them a label if it's not immediately obvious what it means. It will save your users a lot of confusion in the long run, and it will save them being frustrated if they click something and it doesn't do what they expect it to. So in the case of my task list, it might be nice to include a bit of a label to indicate what's going on next to those icons as well. It's not always a requirement, but it is better to assume that the icon isn't universal if you're unsure about it conveying enough context there. So that's a bit on icons. Let's move on to imagery and using imagery on the web in the year 2025. Typically, if you don't have your own imagery, if you're not a very skilled photographer, or have a very skilled photographer friend, you might want to license some imagery from stock sources. Things like Shutterstock, Unsplash, Pexels, Noun Project. The list kind of goes on. They're all really good resources, and they are fully licensed for you to use, and some of those are free as well. Unsplash and Pexels here as an example. They also have video, which is really cool. But in this day and age, you may decide that using AI imagery is something that you want to pursue. I am not going to get into a debate about how I personally feel about generative AI, at least not on the stage. I'll save that for the after party if anyone wants to talk about that. But I do have a word of advice against using solely AI-generated imagery in the hopes that it will fit the bill. Because, yes, ethically, these images are trained on models that steal artwork, plain and simple, but practically, your images just don't look very genuine. Despite the very quick advances that seem to happen every day with ChatGPT and Midjourney and DALL-E and all these, AI still has this look about it. There's this kind of glossy sheen. Images of people can sometimes have this slightly uncanny valley look. Sometimes the detail is just shot to shit. This is an example of something I tried to generate. The door handle is on the wrong side of the door. Why is there a radiator blocking the door shutting? Why is the fire extinguisher all the way up on the wall? Because it's AI, that's why. And God forbid that you want it to generate text. Either it gets the word completely wrong, or it makes itself very obviously AI by looking very samey. This one on the right, I would call the AI font. It also suffers from this thing that is maybe called the AI orange disease, where a lot of these AI images, especially ones generated by ChatGPT, I think, are slowly turning yellow, and they're very obviously AI. In some weird horror twist, there is an AI tool out there to help you remove the yellow tinge. This is a real website. So yeah, unyellow GPT to unyellow your AI images. I feel like I can spot AI images from a mile away, and I know that's not the same for everyone, especially with how realistic they're getting nowadays. But ultimately, seeing quite obviously AI imagery makes me feel like you're cutting corners a bit. So if your options are to use a wholly AI-generated image or nothing, maybe consider nothing. You don't always need images in your projects. That said, I'm not a total AI hater, and I do think there is a use for generative AI. So, and I frequently use it for instances like this. So this is a picture of my two friends. They asked me to turn this image of them into a save the date card for their wedding. And I needed to extend some of the image in order to accommodate some more text into that. So this has always been a very manual process, like in Photoshop, where you try and add extra bits around the image using the clone tool. And it was very manual, and it was very time-consuming, and I hated it. But generative AI has allowed us to make this a bit easier. So that image can now be extended very easily. There was some playing about a little bit to get rid of the van and get rid of the shadow of the person taking the image that you can see there. But ultimately, it did a good enough job for a save the date card. And it saved me that really tedious manual process, which I hate. So that's where I see AI being the most useful when it comes to that. And especially for the web as well. You can extend images so they work better there too. But I see it as a tool. I want AI to steal the boring jobs, not the ones that I actually enjoy doing. So that's why I use it in that way. So that's a little bit around imagery. I focus mostly on AI because I feel like it's the kind of go-to at the minute. So enough talk about that now. I'm sure you've heard plenty about AI during the course of this conference. So let's move on. Let's talk about layout. And this is where we're talking about putting some stuff down on a page. So when I start with a dreaded blank page, scariest thing in the world, I like to start with a grid, or at least columns. It gives you a guide on where to place elements on the page, and typically it's good to have a column structure that is divisible by different numbers, which is why a 12-column grid works pretty perfectly here. So I know I said I was rubbish at maths. This is about my extent. 12 columns is go-to because it's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 6, 1, and itself, I guess, as well. But that makes it a very versatile layout, especially for responsive design. And most importantly to me, it helps us maintain that design principle of balance. So here's typical 12-column layout. I know this is not a revolutionary concept. I'm not up here trying to educate everyone on grids. It is not a modern concept in web development, but in design, it's even less so. Grid systems have been around since books have been being printed, so designers have been familiar with this. But it sets a structure in our design. It is a set of rules to follow similarly to our principles. Which is why I keep coming back to it. So if we take a look, sorry, this shows how we can create a 2-column section. So this might have 2 columns of text, or 2 images, or an image and a bit of text. And it maintains that balance with that kind of symmetrical, invisible line down the middle for symmetry. We can also divide that by 3. So we might have, I don't know, 3 product cards here on a web page. We can also divide that by 4. This is my personal favorite. I don't know why. But I feel like it's nice for balance, and especially for responsive design, because then you can stack 2 on 2, or even 6. So this works quite nicely where we have smaller elements on the page, like icons, for example. What's good about this is that you can also asymmetrically balance your layout. So that's the one I mentioned near the start, where I didn't want to complicate things. But this is just an example where we use that grid in order to dictate the sizes for something. So there might be a sidebar on the left side here, and a big area for copying content on the right. So it still maintains that nice balance because everything is aligned with each other in terms of size and alignment. So grids are that great starting point to give you a clear guide on where to put stuff. And speaking of stuff, I want to talk about the value of repetition. While I didn't put repetition down as a principle to follow, I feel like it's important to consider, especially along that kind of grid system. It's a massive tool in UI design. It brings a sense of unity, cohesiveness, consistency, and it gives users a really clear idea of what to anticipate when browsing and making any actions on a site. So repeatable elements will reinforce that for a user. Also makes developers at my work very happy because they can reuse components that they build multiple times. So where do we start with that? Building a component, or designing a component, not building, that's the wrong word. Designing a component, where do we start? So components can sometimes be built out of lots of little bits, so I advise starting small. A good methodology to follow when doing that is atomic design. I'm sure some here have heard of atomic design. Some may not, so I will run through it. So atomic design is a set of rules to follow when you're making repeating components. It uses this kind of naming convention here to describe how we would build out that component. So starting with the smallest, we have atoms, then it builds up to molecules, and then organisms. That then builds up to pages and templates, but I'm going to stick to these three for the sake of this. So if we start with atoms, they're the most basic building blocks of an interface, very singular. So as an example, say we're building an e-commerce website where we're going to sell some t-shirts. Atoms here could be the image, the product title, and the price tag. But like atoms in nature, they're important, not very useful as a singular. So then that takes us on to molecules. So a molecule is where two or more atoms combine in order to create a slightly larger piece of the interface. So if we take those single atoms, they merge into a molecule. So this is starting to look a little more put together. And then from there, we have organisms. So in a similar fashion to molecules, organisms are made up of two or more molecules combining. So if I just quickly combine a few more atoms here into another molecule, then I have two molecules, and I can combine them into an organism. So now we've got a full product card in action. This is a repeatable element that we can use across our design. And if we go back to our grids and our columns, we can start to use that to lay these components down on the page. There we go. Then we have we have this consistency and this balance in our layout. And if we want to build that out more, we can repeat those again. We can start to add more molecules, organisms into that as well with our drop-downs. And this is starting to build out a page. The thing here is that we're starting off small. We're starting off with these individual elements, putting them together in order to build up this page of content. And then there's that sense of familiarity when we have these repeatable elements. And the upside is that we have to design the component once, and then we can reuse it again. And this is where we see that real sense of balance. Everything's lined up quite nicely with everything else. Balance. That repetition there that we have with the cards means you have to consider that balance and the alignment. This is really important when it comes down to that proximity principle. So if you're putting things down on a page and they're maybe not those repeatable components, make sure that everything kind of aligns with everything else in order to create that sense of belonging, but also create that kind of balance as well. If things don't align, they start to look a bit messy and not very put together there. just want to caveat this before I move on to the last section. I know you've probably all worked on repeating components before, but I like to mention them, and I like to bring up atomic design, even though it's a bit of an oldie, but it's a goodie. But I bring these up because it invites us to really take our time and consider each element by starting off small. If you're not a designer, it can be very overwhelming to have that blank page. I mean, I find it overwhelming having a blank page. But design's hard. It doesn't always have to be, though. You can start with the little things, getting them right first from your typography, your colors, your imagery, and your layout, and then the websites can follow. So, the last section that I want to go through is, well, everything I've said before is great if you're starting from scratch or from near scratch, but you might not be. You might be working with an existing design. You might be working alongside someone else, and they've started to build out a prototype, for example, and ask you for a bit of help on the design. You might be not starting from ground zero there. So how can you apply these principles to something that already exists? I find this is quite a useful tool when I'm working with devs to kind of show them a bit of a before and after to see where those improvements can be in the context of what they're working on. So I'm going to run through a couple of examples before we finish. So I want to start with a card component here, or an organism, if you will. And this is one from a property website. So this is advertising a house for sale. So we've got all the information we need on this card. We have the price, we have the location, the specification, an image gallery, and then a link through there, a call to action, to get the ball rolling and request more details. So the problem here is we're lacking that kind of good hierarchy, some good contrast and a bit of balance as well. So let's take a look at how we can improve that. So both of these cards now display pretty much the same information. They perform the same functions, but with big differences in how that's communicated within the UI design. So firstly, the price. We've identified that as a key element that we need to pull out. So it's the biggest bit of information now. It's bold. We're looking at the hierarchy here. Second, we've used some icons to help condense some of that spec and pull out some key information on the house. I have labeled these icons as well. If you're not too sure, label them just in case. Third, I've got a bit of contrast there on the contact details. So I've pulled that link into a button. I've made that quite a contrasting color, big, filled button, eye-catching. And I've also added the logo in for a bit of trust and familiarity as well. And we've got that neutral palette coming into play a little bit as well with a shade of that purple. So just amping up that contact area a little more. And then lastly, we've adjusted the controls on the image gallery to make them a bit more obvious what they are related to. So we've placed them on top of the image so that it's clear that it will control that image gallery. That just gives them a bit more context as to what they do. And that comes down to the proximity principle. It's directly on the image. They belong together, and they relate to each other. Same with the number of images as well. So a second example is this modal. So what's the problem with this one? It's a permanent destructive action, and that warning is really, really small. Also, our buttons aren't particularly clear. They don't have any real definition or differentiation, should I say, to help us understand what the action we should be taking is there at first glance. So there's a lot of mental load for the user here. So how can we improve this? So in our improved example here, we've made that warning text a bit more prominent just so that we know that the user has seen it. So we've moved it to the top, which isn't always a way to make people read things, as we've learned. But we've also given it a bit of an icon. Now, this icon is more of a universal icon. So we don't need to label it. It's clearly a warning icon, and we've accompanied that with the warning. So hopefully this is more prominent for the user to see. Secondly, we've adjusted the text on the buttons. So let's say delete rather than yes. Let's say cancel instead of no. Really make it clear what clicking this button is going to do and where it's going to take that user. I've also swapped them around. I've put the main action on the right. This is a bit more of a familiar pattern. It's not always the answer. Sometimes they are the other way around, but in a modal, typically, your action is on the right. So I've moved them around. And then lastly, I've looked at the button styling. So I've made one button red, and I know that kind of goes against what I said earlier about color. But we've given one button a full fill, and we've given the other one an outline and no fill. And that provides us with high contrast to the button that we think would be the more typical action there. So the delete button is the primary action, and so it's more prominent with contrast, and the secondary action is less so. So even if the colors weren't applied here, it would still give that prominence to the right sort of button. So these adjustments to the design can help users make quicker, difficult decisions like this. Our next example is how can we make a radio button choice a bit more interesting? We don't always have to, but why not? Seems fine. But I think we can improve it. So let's consider the hierarchy here. What is the big difference between these choices that needs highlighting the most? So these are examples of data plans. So let's make the amount of data per plan the largest differentiator. Let's reduce some of the other elements and make that the kind of largest one. We do also, second in that kind of hierarchy is the price. So we've put that in bold, but we don't want to highlight it too much. Well, the client doesn't anyway. That's what they told me. Second, we'll put these choices into nice big block components. And this creates a really nice sense of balance in our layout. But it also clearly separates out those options a little bit better than that radio button style does. Lastly, our selected state here, so that one in the middle, invites a big level of contrast in comparison to the previous example where it was just the radio button doing that kind of work. It's very clear which one has been chosen here. It has a big outline, it has the big icon, and we're using some of that neutral palette in there as well. So again, these simple kind of really incremental changes can really enhance choices like these and just make the user's experience a little more enjoyable. They're not crucial, but they can really elevate. Here's a really quick example of how we can add a little bit more interest to a simple block of text. This isn't a horrible example by all means, but we can definitely sharpen this up. So here's our other example. So firstly, I've used, and probably the clearest thing there is I've used some bolder font weights for the headings. This is all using the same font, so bolding is a nice way to apply that kind of hierarchy quite well there. Second is thinking about the proximities, so just addressing that line spacing issue again and the paragraph spacing. So there's a lot of issues with that on the left example, so we've fixed that. On the right example, everything's spaced a little more naturally to that flow of how we would read it. And then lastly, we've really read the content and looked at that getting started section. So we can use bullet points, sure, but this is a really nice opportunity to maybe include a little bit more and elevate this. So we've broken this down into a 3-step process and added some number icons instead of those basic kind of bullet points. It's also allowed us to bring in some more of that brand color as well. So this one has a bit of a purple, and we're able to integrate that into the text quite nicely. And most importantly, it makes this section really easy to skim read, which in this day and age is what people do. So again, neither of these are wrong, but I know which one I kind of prefer. My final example, I'm a cat person, This is from a hero section of a website. So this is the first thing that you see if you land on the homepage. So we've got an image there. We have a title, a bit of body copy, 2 buttons, and then that menu at the top. So this is OK. But I can't see the cat, so the design is doomed. But we can fix it. We can fix it. So the biggest thing for me here is that text is sort of readable on the left example. But because we're using that overlay, it doesn't really provide enough contrast. And also, it obscures the cat, as I said. So the revised example here uses, we've got this cat on this solid background. So it's utilizing that background that we have. We've moved that image over, used a bit of a better crop, and that's allowed us to place the text straight onto that kind of yellow background. We've made that black as well for contrast. This is another example where we could use that generative AI just to extend that background as well if we need to. In this case, that was part of the full image. Secondly, we've considered the hierarchy, again, of these buttons. This is an example where the primary one is on the left, though. But yeah, there's 2 buttons next to each other here. I want to make them different. There is a clearer option that I would prefer people to take here, which is the Adopt a Cat button. So I've made that more prominent. I've used that kind of fill effect on there. And again, it's a nice way of introducing more colors from the color palette into there as well. There's no immediate purple on there, and that's part of this brand's color palette, so it's an opportunity there. And finally, I've just looked at that menu section at the top. Similarly to the rest of the white content on the left example, it wasn't particularly contrasting enough over that image. So on the menu there, I've given it a bit of a fill. It's still got a little bit of opacity there, but it's a lot more readable, that text. I've also pulled out the donation button as well and made that filled. So again, very, very small changes that can make a very big difference. And it all comes back to these principles a lot of the time. The more we kind of keep coming back to these, the more we can consider the things that we might need to change or start with in our design. If you've missed any of the resources that you might have wanted to see or check out the slides at all, they are on my Notice site. I will probably post these on Blue Sky, maybe this evening, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week when I return home. And that's my website as well, if anyone wants to have a look. I should update it more, but here we go. Thank you very much. Thank you. If there are feedback cards, please be very honest with the feedback cards. And if you have any feedback or questions, or you need a little bit of design advice, I'll be sticking around for the last talk of the day, and I'll be at the after party as well. So thank you.